Welcome to Federation Hall at the Southbank campus. And I always have to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And we're very proud in our acknowledgements to say that we believe on this land for 1,000 generations, people have been making art, singing their songs, dancing, telling their stories. And I think here at the faculty, with our colleagues in the two schools that make up now the newly titled Faculty of Fine Arts and Music, which contains very proudly the Victorian College of the Arts and the Melbourne Conservatorium, we continue that tradition. We also hope that if you like, the restoration of the power of Indigenous art making and culture is not only restored to those people who have direct origins, but with our new members of our community and the people who continue to come to this land. So on behalf of all of us in the faculty, I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and perhaps equally importantly, the future. So tonight we're going to have, I hope, and in fact I'm pretty sure, a really interesting conversation. This is becoming almost a series of conversations that I've been involved in the last few years, and I think tonight will be a particularly interesting one, and I'm sure your presence indicates that you feel the same. Jonathan Mills, AO, is the Program Director of the Edinburgh International Culture Summit, which is only really one of his present positions and titles. But you also, I'm sure, know that he is a composer of international standing with several award-winning theatre works and operas. He's written for orchestra and chamber ensemble. His opera, Eternity Man, was recognised in the early part of this century, if I can say that, Jonathan, in 2003. And his oratorio, Sandakan Threnody, in 2005. And these works presented in Australia and around the world have made him one of our great contributors to the music that's coming from this country. He's been director, obviously, of many multi-arts festivals in Australia and in the UK, and of course, most significantly, the Edinburgh Festival, where he was director from 2007 to 2014. As I've said, he's also presently involved in activities in Edinburgh, first of all as part of this International Culture Summit. This is a UNESCO organised event which is held in conjunction with the present Edinburgh Festivals in summer, and he's currently president of the EFFE, which stands for the Europe for Festivals for Europe group. And it was initiated by the European Festivals Association. I don't know how many festivals, maybe that's a question for tonight, there are in Europe every year, but
40,000.
50,000.
40,000.
40,000. Well, I'm sure there'll be 50,000 soon. And indeed, festivals have become one of the main vehicles for the development, perpetuation of the arts, particularly the performing arts around the world. But most particularly, and the reason he's with us tonight, last year Jonathan became an enterprise professor of this faculty and this university, and we're very pleased that he joins as one of our professors his work with both the Edinburgh University and Yale University. So without further from me, I introduce Jonathan Mills.
Thank you.
So, Jonathan, we've termed this conversation.
Sure.
And I think we've also agreed that we're going to try and tackle a few areas that we hope will be of particular interest to the audience, things that may lie behind the public knowledge, but unavoidably there will be some conversations and questions from me about the things that people know you've done already.
Of course.
But I thought we'd agree to start with our mutual friend, teacher, mentor, and one of our great lost friends of Australia and of Australian music, Peter Sculthorpe. Now, we've both been students of Peter, me a little bit before you, but I was just wondering, is there a connection in your mind between studying with Peter as a composer and what you've done that's beyond composition and beyond being a composer? Because obviously that kind of going out beyond being a creative musician is something that is, I think, of interest to many people.
Peter was an enabler. He was very pragmatic. Having returned from Oxford, he set himself some challenges. I happen to believe they were the right kinds of challenges for any artist to set himself or herself. They were the challenges of what do I do and how does it matter? How does it resonate beyond the immediate circumstances of those who are similarly fanatical about music or dance or theatre or the visual arts? How do I get a message across to a broader audience? And in the context of Australia in the 50s and 60s, there was an even more fundamental question, which was, how was it possible, could one call oneself an Australian composer or visual artist or theatre maker and so forth? I don't think Peter, a lot has been said about the very particular nature of Peter's work as an Australian composer and his insistence for himself on a particular kind of aesthetic trajectory. But as a teacher, he was not pedantic in that way. He didn't insist that you had to be someone of a particular mould. He wasn't trying to mould us.
So he was still doing the same thing with you, probably nearly 15, maybe not quite 20 years after, because I was with Peter in the 60s, you're in the 80s.
Early 80s.
Yes, and so that kind of teaching through being is how I remember him. So it's interesting you raised that.
Yeah,
too.
But it was absolutely that. But what I think how Peter challenged you was to say, the world is shrinking, and he was even saying that in the early 80s. Technology is making music available in ways that was certainly not possible when he was growing up. It meant that you knew a lot more repertoire, you knew a lot more of what was going on than a previous generation. And that was both an opportunity, but it was a challenge, if you saw it as such. So for Peter, the biggest question that he always asked us was, what is the context in which you make work? What is your particular point of view? What is your perspective? You actually have to learn a myriad of techniques, and Peter was not interested in teaching that. He thought other parts of the course at the university were there to do that. Species, counterpoint, orchestration, all of the things that you can relate to in your various disciplines that are not specifically about music, but in terms of painting, in terms of dance and so forth. What he wanted to know, though, is what did you have to say, and how did it reflect the circumstances in which you choose to live your life?
So my question, linking that with, we now jump forward to you becoming the artistic director of, I suspect, the biggest and certainly the most famous arts festival on the planet. Did you carry with you, between working with Peter and being offered this position, was there things that you think link those two things?
I do. It certainly wouldn't have been possible for me to have been the artistic director of the Edinburgh Festival, in terms of my own career, 10 or 15, even 15 years earlier, I probably was lucky that I came to that position at the right time for me. I came to it by accident, I have to say. I almost didn't get on the plane to go to the interview, and my agent cajoled me into it with the admonition that, how dare I be so arrogant? Of course I wouldn't get the job, but it was a free fare to the United Kingdom.
So you were in Australia at that time?
I was, and that I was at that stage negotiating with Channel 4 for an opera, for a film to be made of The Eternity Man. Channel 4 bring composers and filmmakers together, or they did at that stage, not to film something on stage, but to actually conceive of an opera as a film from scratch. And they did about 10 or 15 of these, and they were because this opera had been performed in London at the Almeida, and it was a commission of the Almeida and Aldeburgh festivals, Almeida Opera and the Aldeburgh Festival. Yep. They were interested in it. It was at a delicate moment in the negotiation, so my agent said, get to London, go and do this silly interview in Edinburgh, come back to London, make the negotiation of what you really mean. But don't be stupid. Don't make a fool of yourself in Edinburgh. Do the interview seriously. It was the best advice because I was entirely liberated. I had 48 hours to think about what I was going to say at this interview, and there was an element of Peter in the back of my mind, and it was this: the challenge of Edinburgh in 1947 was a very existential one. In 1947, at the time that Edinburgh was started, there was food and petrol rationing. You could only have had that festival in a handful of cities of that scale, because 90% of Europe, 90% of the cities of Britain were so badly bombed and destroyed in the war that they had none of their cultural infrastructure in place. So if you were thinking about holding a festival in the United Kingdom in 1947, Bath, Oxford and Edinburgh were really the only 3 or 4, there were maybe a couple of others. Couldn't do it in London or Manchester or Glasgow or Coventry or Birmingham or anywhere you might imagine, because there was simply nothing intact. And so Edinburgh, in a sense, had a secret weapon, a woman called Eva Rosebery, who was determined that it was her city that got the festival. So Edinburgh in 1947 does something truly remarkable. It doesn't sound that remarkable today, but the very first orchestra to perform at the very first festival was the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. So what? Except when you think that every member of that orchestra 2 years earlier, had they appeared in the United Kingdom, would have been incarcerated as an enemy alien. Here we are 2 years later, an orchestra introducing its music, and it was still the case that Mahler wasn't that known in the UK at that stage, introducing Gustav Mahler's music, a Jewish composer, given all of that, converted to Catholicism, given all of the history of the last 5 or 6 years, with a Viennese orchestra, the birthplace of Hitler, performing with Bruno Walter. And in a sense, that was the most remarkable statement of what culture can do and what culture can transcend.
Did you say this during the interview for the job when you went to Edinburgh? I mean, you obviously knew this, or is this something you...
Well, I said something different. What I said was, if that was what you achieved in 1947, what is your challenge today in a much changed world? What are the boundaries, what are the challenges of being that open-minded and generous in 2007, which was, if I'd got the job as I did, was going to be my first festival. And I said, what we need to do is we need to understand that a festival, even like Edinburgh, will only exist if it constantly reinvents itself, if it constantly reconsiders what is the essence of what makes it special. And so I said, so what are the things that are remarkable between Brian McMaster, my immediate predecessor, and me taking on the job? And I identified three. The emergence of China and India as major economic forces, which when Brian had taken over the festival from Frank Dunlop in 1992 was not the case. The development of the World Wide Web and the mapping of the human genome, none of which had been contemplated in 1992. So that shows you just how substantial some of these changes and challenges are and how rapid the impacts of them are. So what I went about doing was, and this is where the echo of the guru Sculthorpe comes into it, is to say, well, if we are a European festival, or if we are a festival in Europe, and if the challenge in 1947 was for this festival to connect with cultures that previously had been at war with each other, what is the challenge today? I think the challenge today is to ask some fundamental questions about the nature of Europe. Is Europe prescribed by the 27 member states of the European Union, or is it more aspirational? Does Turkey have a real basis for considering itself part of Europe? Istanbul looks west and east simultaneously. Are there countries in the Balkans that actually think of themselves in two places at once?
So how did that impact on what you did?
Well, it impacted very directly by, I started from a position in Edinburgh that I said, first year we will be very European. The second year we will look at what Europe means in a broader sense. So we had the idea that artists ignore borders. Artists are beyond borders. There is a political border, and then there's this idea of an artistic milieu that is quite different from any politically imposed border. And if you think about that in the context of Europe, in the context of the Berlin Wall being brought down in 1989, in the context of the devastation and destruction of Srebrenica, in the issues of the conversation about Turkey's membership of the EU, in the conversations about whether Europe is Christian or Jewish or Islamic or all of these things. I mean, it was pretty interesting conversation when we think about what Europe's struggling with today. And so we actually looked at a whole range of cultures, and we went back to some examples from Europe's own history. The city of Cordoba is a great example. In Cordoba, there is a place called the Mezquita. This is a church that is a cathedral now, but started its life as a mosque, and sort of as a kind of almost defiant giant phallus. The cathedral is built in the center of the mosque, but outside the mosque there is actually a wall in which the Sephardic tradition sang their poetry. And in Cordoba, from the Caliphate of Cordoba around the 9th to the 12th century, you had this extraordinary intermingling, very successful intermingling of what the Spanish now call la convivencia, the peaceful coexistence of the Islamic, of the Jewish and the Christian traditions. And it's not just that they coexisted in a peaceful way. They actually borrowed from each other. So you will have a Sephardic Jewish tune with an Islamic text. You will have a Christian text with a Jewish song and so forth. It's hybrid. More than that, it is one of those areas, particularly in Toledo, where there was a great library where a lot of what we know about Europe today springs from. It was in that library in Toledo, people as far removed as a great Scottish poet, a model for Shakespeare in his Troilus and Cressida, a man called Robert Henryson writes The Testament of Crusade. He finds his way from, you know, from the Highlands of Scotland to Toledo in the 10th, 11th century. How did he get there? What made him go there? So, those sorts of things started to become really important in my thinking. And what I did was I radiated further and further away from automatically assuming that this festival had to be exclusively about European culture. In 1947, there was an existential challenge in Europe, which is saying, if we possibly knew more about each other in Europe, maybe we wouldn't have been so quick to destroy each other. But in 2007, the arguments are of a different kind, but they are still about a deep respect and knowledge of other people's cultures, of other perspectives, of the position of the other in your own world.
So does that, once again, so that 2007, 2008, you find your trajectory as director, and as we all know, in 2008, 2009, there is an economic calamity. Did that affect the festival and affect your thinking about being director?
It didn't affect my the way in which I approached the programming. It made me a much more tough bargainer. And I just was very blunt with people to say, we would love you, and we can't afford your fee. How are we going to get there?
So there were issues that flowed from that period in terms of budgets.
I'll be very honest. We are very lucky to put on an Edinburgh Festival, even in a good year. Anywhere other than Edinburgh would cost you 3 times the amount.
Oh, so why is that?
Because people want to come to Edinburgh. Because they consider it as part of a particular artistic pilgrimage. So, put it another way, the budget of the Edinburgh Festival is about 12 to 15 million pounds, which is about 25 million Australian dollars. For that, we do an orchestra every night. If you were to do that at the Melbourne Festival, so it's 24 nights, that's already $24 million, just in one venue. We do 4 operas, that's probably 5 million an opera, if you're doing it in Australia. So that's another 20 million. And there's probably 5 or 6 ballet companies or dance companies, that's $1 million each. So that's how it adds up. But we do it for a much more modest fee. But there's another secret to it, which is that the top price in Edinburgh for an opera, the top ticket you would have to pay for an opera in full production, which is the most expensive ticket we charge, is £99. That's a premium ticket,
wow, yeah.
Which is cheaper than festivals in Australia charge for the same sort of thing. Now, admittedly, if you're coming from Australia, you have an airfare. You have a whole range of other ancillary costs. But what we do in Edinburgh, and I think it needs to be, people in this country need to be encouraged to think about this more, is we don't price our tickets on the basis of what each individual event costs. We price our tickets on the basis of how many nights we would like someone in the town and what the entire experience of the festival might be for that person and what therefore is affordable. So on average, and this comes from also the idea that of the of the 450,000 tickets that an Edinburgh International Festival sells, which is part of about 3 million tickets that are issued in Edinburgh in August, we would expect people to come to the International Festival for 9 nights. And of those, several 100,000 people that come to the Edinburgh International Festival, probably 60% of them do not come from Edinburgh or Scotland. And that is a different way of thinking.
Has it always been like, is that a growing, obviously 47 it begins, it's a big trajectory to 2007, 2008. Is that the internationalisation of the audience, has that something that's built over time?
Yes, it was. I think in the first years, it was a national audience within the UK. And as a reflection on that, in those early years of the festival, one of the most remarkable things to have been achieved was an organisation called Festival Rooms. There was an acknowledgement that there was simply not enough hotel beds and rooms, and given the rationing of petrol and food, how would people sustain themselves in this remarkable celebration of culture? And people opened their own, their spare bedrooms in their houses. We have a situation now in Edinburgh where a third generation from the same family is travelling to Edinburgh to be in the room that their grandparents were in Edinburgh. And I can think of nothing more extraordinarily generous than a citizen of a city, through several generations, opening their spare room and sharing their city with people who've become now lifelong friends. So I think, as much as we, in the context of the professional context in which one would talk about the organisation, the planning, the programming of a festival in a faculty like this, I think that there's a broader message that we all need to convey to those who make policy, whether they're politicians or officials, which is that it's the unintended consequences, it's the connections of people that matter even more. And guess what? The most powerful way to connect people is to allow them to sing together, to dance together, to recite each other's poetry, to learn from each other's perspectives of the world. And I think that's what was attempted in Edinburgh. It was attempted because, when you think about it, what was going to work? A statistical argument about the war dead, that's not much fun. Or the proper and orderly dismantling of a giant military apparatus that was only starting and was hardly underway. People were shocked. The phenomenon that was Auschwitz was just filtering through. The siege of Leningrad was only just becoming known to people. And these surely shocked most ordinary citizens in the most profound way. What was their response? I think it was the entirely natural response to want to meet and connect with people. And so, beyond any of the questions of how good, how bad, how innovative, how conservative a program is, I think our broader responsibility, and this comes back to Peter, is what is the context in which we are making art? Who is it for? What does it matter? Why does it matter? What does it mean? And in the context of Peter's teaching of you and me, I think he was exploring what it meant to be taken seriously as an artist in Australia.
Can I now? We've spent a fascinating time. I hope everybody agrees about the festival, about you for a considerable period of time, and I'm sure we could talk for the rest of our time here and beyond about that. But if we go back to the other connection with Peter, which is actually being a composer, being a creative person, and one of the things that we said we'd try and bring out was how do you balance, how do you deal with the fact that you've had these achievements as a manager, as a leader of events and things, with what I assume, if it's anything like what I know, the inner world of being a creative person. And we've got a lot of people, both in this room and in this campus, who are beginning to deal with that, and of course our mature staff members. So what's your kind of take or your story about maintaining a creative life at the same time, I mean a musical creative life, at the same time as taking on these big responsibilities with huge budgets and hundreds of people, etc.?
I said at the beginning of this conversation that I almost didn't go to the interview in Edinburgh. I'm very pleased I did, by the way. It was a great opportunity, and I would not have wanted to miss it for the world. But I was certainly naive. I'd been able to write music and maintain my job as the artistic director of the Melbourne Festival. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. It was almost impossible in Edinburgh because the scale of the event is so much greater. It's 10 times the size. So I had to find a way in which I was nourished and sustained myself, and that was by learning about other cultures. I think it was my finishing school in a way. The process of programming Edinburgh.
So you didn't write a lot of music during this period?
Not a lot.
Okay.
I didn't. I'll be honest. I had a lot of ideas percolating, and I've written a lot of music since.
We'll come to that in a second.
But I wasn't able to do as much as I would like. What I found, though, the other thing I had no idea whether I could do or not, and certainly I would not underestimate the challenge, but I wouldn't underestimate the capacity of people in this room finding their way to an executive role. When I was at the Melbourne Festival, the artistic director's role was very, very particular. There was a general manager or managing director, in my case Ian Roberts, who worked in parallel with the artistic director, and we both reported to the board of the festival. In Edinburgh, the festival director is also the chief executive of the organisation.
Oh, right, okay.
I learned very quickly how to delegate. I learned how to find a chief operating officer. I was very lucky in finding the right person. I did so on the basis that I would have to travel a lot, and there needed to be someone minding the fort, as it were. But what I also learned, and I hope that many of you will have a similar opportunity someday, is that you find your way to a leadership role from your knowledge as an artist, not instead of or as in opposition to that. It's your knowledge of the repertoire, it's your knowledge of the creative process that empowers you to be an effective manager. A lot of management speak and management education is about how to create very efficient systems in which the maximum efficiency can be achieved. Now, that's all very well for very large organisations, and I'm not suggesting that the Edinburgh Festival is tiny, but it's not, a BHP with tens of thousands of employees. So let's put that in perspective. Let me offer to you an insight, which is that I honestly had no idea whether I could be a CEO of an organisation of the international prestige and certainly the focus of the Edinburgh Festival. And may I add, there are a lot of people in the media who didn't think I could do it either.
Because it was quite a controversial appointment, if I remember rightly.
No question. It was.
Was there a bloody Australian part of that? I can't remember.
No question.
Yeah.
No question about
bloody
all of
young
that.
Australian.
Well, all of those things, one had to make light of it, but one had to actually be a little bit defiant. What was great about it was that it was so extreme that even if all I did was turn up and not have every dance company in grass skirts, I was going to be judged as somewhat of a success. So one of the things I would say is that always look for the opportunity, even in the most extreme criticism. Never waste a crisis, even if it's a crisis about your own identity. And so, but what I found, where I found the strength, to the extent that I had any, was I had to go back and rely on very fundamental principles. What was it like to hear the first time you heard your own music? What was it like to be in a rehearsal room with someone else performing it for the first time? What was it like to be in a dance environment, to see a choreographer work with your music? What were those experiences like? And then you build from those very intimate experiences an understanding of what artists go through. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that festivals should only be curated or organised by artists.
It's not a bad idea, though.
But in a sense, I feel obliged to make that argument on behalf of artists, because the orthodoxy is the opposite, that artists can't always be trusted with either the budgets or the discipline or the responsibility. I think that's nonsense. I think that artists solve problems. They solve problems for themselves in very particular ways. Artists have to be flexible. The show that you thought was in a 1,500 seat theatre suddenly is in a 200 seat theatre. The lighting that you thought was magnificent is one person following you on a spotlight. You make it work. And what you have to do is extrapolate from those experiences on a much broader canvas. But the other thing that I think artists bring to this equation uniquely is an intimate knowledge of the repertoire. Now, I didn't know a lot about theatre until I started at the Melbourne Festival, and I certainly didn't know enough about theatre probably before I got to Edinburgh. I had strong views and I'd probably done reasonable theatre programs here, but I knew enough to know what questions to ask about a discipline beyond my own. It wasn't the same discipline, but there was a correlation that enabled me to ask questions about theatre practice or dance practice or opera and music were relatively, not easy for me, but I was relatively fluent with that repertoire.
Did you, in your festivals, in the Edinburgh festivals that were yours, is there a Jonathan thing there that you think is yours? Is there a kind of clear difference between what was before and possibly will come after? Is there something you think of as...
That's a hard thing for me to answer,
yeah.
But to the extent that I can share that, I guess I was very fortunate in following an artistic director who'd been there for nearly 16 years. He had approached the festival in an entirely legitimate way. Brian McMaster had come from the Welsh National Opera. So he approached the making of a festival very much like an intendant at an opera house would, finding a group of very, very particular collaborators and working with them on a very regular basis. So Peter Stein, Calixto Baeto, Alfred Brendel, Charles Mackerras, a few others were almost at every festival that Brian curated. And that's legitimate. I'm not for a minute suggesting that that is other than really appropriate way of approaching, because after a while you get into a groove with those people and you can, as a curator, suggest more and more radical things for them to do, more things that are counterintuitive. Allow them, they trust you, allow them to go on a journey that they may not have foreseen.
Well, lots of filmmakers we know.
Yeah.
Certain filmmakers have the same crew for many years.
I knew intuitively that I couldn't do that. That what Edinburgh was crying out for was a whole way of curating it that was different, partly because there were many very important artists, because of Brian's focus, that had never been to an Edinburgh Festival. In the case of music, for example, Brian had obviously suffered, as some of us had, with the very early examples of authentic performance practice. And in those early days, one was hissing and farting through natural horns and hearing this music played in a kind of unedifying way. But fast forward 20, 30 years, these ensembles are so good and so successful and so prolific that actually symphony orchestras, mainstream symphony orchestras, don't perform that repertoire to the extent that they used to. Yeah. It would take a lot for a symphony orchestra in Europe to perform a Haydn symphony, because they don't want to be compared poorly to a specialist ensemble like the Orchestra of the 18th Century or the Age of Enlightenment or Philippe Herreweger's Collegium Vocale performing Bach.
That might be starting to happen here too, yes. I think. Yeah.
Sure. So one of the things I did was I broadened the repertoire. I mean, I remember a critic from the Glasgow Herald saying, "Do you think people will come?" This is a true story. I mean, do you think people will come to all of this early music? I said, "Are you kidding? You think people won't come to a cantata of Bach?" What? Or a Madrid? So, you know, in my first festival, we did 17 concerts. We did 6 concerts of Monteverdi madrigals with Rinaldo Alessandrino and Concerto Italiano. And what I did with Rinaldo was ask him to look at this concert like an exhibition. Now, they're the oil paintings, they're the major works. But that doesn't tell you the full story of the thinking process behind an exhibition. Because I often find in visual arts exhibitions, the most intriguing things are the sketches. The little things that indicate a spontaneous thought. So what I asked him to do was, let's look at the madrigals that lead to the great madrigals, the madrigals without which the great madrigals would never have been written. Mm-hmm. So we had our major oils, and we had our sketches, and we had our works on paper and all of that. They were all madrigals. And then I said, okay, what we do now is that what enabled Monteverdi to get to the point where he could actually write those madrigals in that particular way. There's a whole history from the 11th century. And what we did was we picked the eyes out of the great period of European polyphony from the Notre Dame school in the 12th century right through to Monteverdi in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. Now, that's the kind of detail you can go into in a program in Edinburgh. And in a sense, what I learnt about what was possible in Edinburgh is many festivals go broad, not many go deep. And I think that we need to understand that but both are necessary. That actually, a festival presents an audience with an opportunity to do many dispersed and diverse things, but it also provides an audience with an opportunity to narrow down and go into every single possible permutation and combination of what a particular artistic impulse might have been.
I think you've answered my question, though, about what makes your festival, because in a sense, obviously a festival can be merely very clever and well thought through and well researched, knowledge-based series of events. But it's obvious, and I've known you long enough to know that you can't do that. You have to have a thread. You have to have a deeper kind of understanding of what links all these.
Well, I start from the premise, which is what connects music and drama, what connects dance and opera, what connects words and music, or words spoken and words sung. And so in my very first festival, I wanted to try this out. It was 2007. It was an important anniversary, not of a birth or death. It was an important anniversary in European culture, because it was not to the month, but to the year, the anniversary of the first performance of Orfeo by Monteverdi. In devising Orfeo, Monteverdi asks all of us, whether we are theatre makers or dancers or musicians, what are the relationships that we are looking at between music and stagecraft, words and spectacle, plot and orchestral texture? What is this thing that he calls a favola in musica, a fable in music, where the words and the music come together and create a unique space of equality? And in the case of Monteverdi, what is so extraordinary about Orfeo is that the notion of the here and the there, the this life and the next, is beautifully represented in the music between the way in which the voice sits literally between this world and the next. And it is, of course, a work of genius that all composers subsequently lament that we will never get quite as right as Monteverdi did. But he does create this absolutely beautiful and perfect perspective. But in doing so, he's channeling the resources, the origins of our own culture, of the notion that Greek drama is not just the text. It is the spectacle, it is the amphitheatre, it is the interplay between space and time. It is the atmosphere of the summer evening in that perfect acoustic that actually makes possible that rare experience. So what I tried to do with Edinburgh was to say that there must be a correlation between the dance, the music, the theatre, the opera, and the visual arts programs. And using Monteverdi as an example, we looked at other, and this idea of words and music, it was reasonably easy to do it in music, but Trisha Brown became a really important part of that program because she was looking at ways in which the notion of text could be reflected in the notion of gesture. So there was a sort of element of that in the dance program. In the theatre program, we had Barry Kosky doing his very sassy, very, very naughty version of Poppaea, another Monteverdi opera, where quite naturally an aria from Poppaea turns into a song of Cole Porter. So suddenly this beautiful recitative where Poppaea is asking what her relationship with her father might be turns into My Heart Belongs to Daddy, in only a way that Barry Kosky could do, and make it actually really authentic. And then in another opera, I mean, we had Jordi Savall doing a proper, full, beautiful production of Orfeo. with the Hesperian 21 and the Capel Real de Catalunya. It was wonderful. And so what did I think was a contemporary resonance of that? And we went and we commissioned, and we got Marcus Stenz to do a new production of Capriccio of Strauss. Capriccio is an opera by Strauss in which it's almost impossible to believe that you could write an opera like Capriccio in 1942. It's almost impossible to imagine that you should have done that, and yet Strauss does. It's the absolute burying your head in the sand, and yet there's this little moment at the end where the Countess says, "I've heard the poet, I've heard the composer, I'm in the twilight of my years. What do I really think matters? Is it words or music?" And the way in which Strauss gives us some sense that he mightn't have been completely naive is that he lets that question hang in the air. He doesn't resolve it. He resolves it in the orchestration. He never resolves it in the dramaturgy. So it is through these little building blocks, all of which will be very familiar to you in your own practice, that I think one makes a festival. This is the stuff in which we are all familiar, and it is, frankly, the sorts of things that you as artists imagine every day of your lives solving. And what a festival asks you to do is approach that material not in a way that you are responsible directly for performing or creating, but where you are indirectly responsible for the juxtaposition of these materials in order to have a bigger conversation with those who come to the festival, who come on its journey.
So we are getting towards the end of our time, believe it or not, certainly believe it or not for me, and I suspect many members of the audience. We don't have explicit facility for taking questions.
But we can repeat the question.
We can, I think it's, I'm sure there are many questions in the air, and we've got a little time just to see from you guys, from the audience, whether there is particular questions you'd like to put to Jonathan. It's a bit hard for us to see, so. Sir, yes, sir.
Well, sadly, I don't know that I can offer any insights into the Banking Royal Commission. And I think it's important to acknowledge the limits of the organisations that we as artists are asked to take a leadership role. They are not vast multinational corporations that do one thing and replicate it or expand it or scale it up. What we do is very different. It requires a lot of differentiation, it requires a lot of detail and a lot of attention to detail. So it is much more bespoke. That's the first thing to say. And it requires, therefore, a lot of people to have complementary expertise. And one of the challenges, I think, that we face is that we are told that we are not expert if we don't speak a particular jargon. I reject that. I think that as long as we can speak clearly in simple sentences in the language that we grew up in, we have every capacity to express a leadership position. But sadly, that is not the way of the world. There are many, many careers that have been built on jargon and the exclusivity of jargon and the requirement of jargon to be a member of a particular club, a management club in this instance. So I think one of the things that we need to do is be bold to understand the difference between speaking like a manager and acting like a manager. There's a very big difference. I know a lot of people who talk the talk, who speak in management speak, who haven't a clue what they're actually talking about. And I put to you, Tom, as a distinguished dramaturg and theatre maker, that you have a lot of a head start in most people in management, because you actually understand narrative, you understand conflict, you understand how people relate to each other on stage. And frankly, that's the place you should start in thinking about the interaction and the relationships. There's a whole literature of theatre that you know better than anyone in a management situation that you're likely to meet that you can bring to that conversation. And I think you need to be confident enough to be able to extrapolate those particular learnings and knowledges for any scenario that you're likely to face. I certainly have nothing like the knowledge of theatre that you have, and yet I had enough knowledge of it to recognise, you know, the conflict zones, the over-eager flattering, you know, the Restoration comedy, the Greek tragedy in everyone, if you like. All of that, all of that. And so in a sense, what I'm really saying beyond that, though, is what I learnt most of all from doing the Edinburgh Festival is that, there is a great connection between different cultures, but the deep connection between different cultures is only the beginning of the conversation you need to have, because it's the difference that is the universe. And so if we were talking, as we were a minute ago, about Monteverdean opera, I would put to you, is opera as Monteverdi imagined it an exclusively European pursuit? I would say that it isn't. I would argue that there is the idea of opera, this idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk, as Wagner calls it, or a Favolo in Musica, as Monteverdi refers to it, this idea of ritual and ceremony and music and dance and theatre all intermingling in a kind of connectedness in one particular performance, is common to all cultures, whether it's kabuki, whether it's Jingju or Yueju opera, whether it's the voodoo ceremonies from Haiti or the great Hindu epics like the Mahabharata. These are all operatic in our terms. And what our knowledge of repertoire can do beyond the immediate fluency that we can have of a particular scenario is enable us to abstract and extract the deeper connectedness between cultures that is so profoundly important, and is so profoundly important in a networked world that we're living in at the moment.
I think we
have time for a couple more.
Yeah. Do you want?
Yeah. If others don't have to go, I certainly don't.
So at least one more question. I mean, the inherent danger with asking a question of Jonathan is that we explore a whole peripheral universe, but I think we can take certainly another question. Yes? Aha, we do have microphones.
Jonathan, the conversation started with education and your own education. And I guess you've also just sort of talked about the knowledge production that happens in a festival context, in public, this kind of depth of knowledge in situ where you're reaching a large number of people. Could you talk a little bit about your kind of more recent work coming to institutions like this one and going and working in universities, and I guess how you see the educational situation today, or the pedagogical situation, and what you feel that sort of offers you, and also what you're bringing into it and what you're seeing in your educational travels.
Yes. So I have appointments at 3 universities. This one, at Yale and at the University of Edinburgh. Each institution has asked me to do something different, but there is a connection. At the University of Edinburgh, I was asked to do what I had done when I was in Melbourne working at RMIT. I have a degree in architecture and particularly in environmental acoustics, and I'm very interested in asking designers to think about sound as a primary inspiration, not just the visual, but sound as a primary inspiration for their designs. So can you build a building that is multisensory? Can you build a building that isn't multisensory, is my argument. Can you build a building that doesn't just look great, but feels great, sounds great, has a kind of tactile nature to it, rather like a sculpture that just feels entirely appropriate? So that's what I was asked to do at the University of Edinburgh. Yale University has a very particular challenge. The dean there asked me into a conversation. He said, I have a great concern. We at Yale are well funded. We could continue to educate people to a very high degree, which they do, wonderfully well. For what end? What is the context in which they will understand their role as musicians? Will an orchestra or even a program, as we understand it today, exist in 20 or 30 years? The challenge that Glyn Davis originally set to me here was we have some extraordinary resources at this university that by and large the community of Melbourne don't know about. There are true riches that are owned and maintained by this university that no one knows about. At the Granger Museum, in the presence of the most important building that Walter Burley Griffin designed that still exists, in the Hirschfeld Mack material. Everywhere you look in this institution, there are extraordinary resources. How do we link those into the scholarship of the place for a more enhanced connection between the collections of the university and the pedagogy? So those are the 3 distinct challenges. What connects them all, I suspect, is context. And what I mean by that is, at a time when we can no longer automatically assume that anyone coming into an institution like this will have had the kind of opportunities that Barry and I had, not with Peter Sculthorpe, but long before we reached the orbit of Peter Sculthorpe. Music education was part of our schooling. What are the implications of that today? We have become very narrow, and I say that we should all bear a certain responsibility for that. But those who are most attached to that narrowness are politicians and policymakers who don't seem to understand the connection between things and are then genuinely surprised by the implications and repercussions of that disconnectedness. I had a conversation that I think is at the core of this, and I was mentioning this to Gary McPherson earlier. I had a conversation with a remarkable neuroscientist at the University of Southern California called Antonio Damasio. If you don't know about his work, I urge you all to look him up online and explore what his ideas are. He's at the center for, I think it's called The Brain and Creativity, or certainly Brain and Creativity are amongst the titles of the center that he has. His argument is that those communities, those countries, those places that are starting to make a fundamental investment from early childhood in the creativity of their community will benefit in a world that is going to be so unknowable to us even today, because what those those opportunities provide is not knowledge of the world, it's not knowable, but a way in which we might conceive of how to navigate and be flexible in that world. And so I think it is nothing short of tragic that we have become victims of a certain narrow policy setting that does not do justice to even the most pragmatic challenges that we will face in terms of automation, artificial intelligence, how to survive the World Wide Web, how to survive in a networked world. And I think that there are remarkable opportunities for the cultural sector to show a very different perspective of how those networks might work. Because if you accept that after printing, our memories became disembodied through libraries, the publication, what we knew in the world, the ancient world, we had to carry with us. In the world after Gutenberg publishes his Bible, you actually have a proliferation of knowledge that could be stored over there, so it's disembodied. I would suggest that the internet has decontextualized our knowledge of the world, which means that on average, an internet community, you're speaking or engaging with someone that has a very different history, a very different perspective from your own. That, to me, suggests that we need to know much more about other people's cultures, not less, that we shouldn't become siloed, that we need to become fluent in other cultures, much more fluent in other cultures. And I think that presents the greatest reason for an investment in a faculty like this, and the greatest opportunity for a faculty like this to think of itself. And isn't it great that all the art forms that we know about, and some that are yet to be particularly invented, perhaps, are going to be cohabiting here in a very short time. And I look forward to those things bumping into each other in very disruptive but very creative ways.
How can we not end on that note? Thank you very much, Jonathan.